Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Water has memory. Not the scientific understanding of molecular structures, but something deeper. Something primordial. A memory that retains trauma, preserves pain, holds on to unfinished stories. My name is Elena Ramirez, and I have returned to Riverside, a town now more liquid than land. The flood claimed everything 3 years ago: homes, dreams, lives. What remained was a landscape of broken rooftops and silent streets, where water reflected the sky like a fractured mirror. The morning I arrived, a peculiar mist hung over the submerged town. Not the natural morning fog, but something thicker. Something alive. It moved with deliberate slowness, curling around abandoned buildings like spectral fingers exploring forgotten memories. My documentary equipment felt heavy. Professional cameras. High-end sound recorders. Waterproof cases designed to capture the environmental tragedy of a town consumed by rising waters. But as I stood on the wooden pier extending from what used to be Main Street, I realized this story was far more complex than environmental destruction. Something watched me. Not with malevolence. Not with anger. But with an intense, desperate need to be understood. The first drop of water sounded like a heartbeat. Riverside had always been vulnerable. Nestled between two rivers, surrounded by hills that seemed to funnel water directly into the town's heart. Geological reports I'd studied showed decades of warnings. Ignored scientific predictions. Climate change models that nobody wanted to believe. But this was more than a story about environmental negligence. This was about something else. When I first stepped onto the pier, the wood creaked beneath my feet. Not with the natural sound of aged timber, but with a sound that felt like a whisper. A memory trying to escape. My reflection in the water moved slightly out of sync with my actual movements. A subtle difference. So small that a rational mind would dismiss it immediately. But I saw it. A shadow that didn't belong to me, shifting just beyond the edge of perception. I turned quickly, but saw nothing except the endless gray water and the skeletal remains of buildings. The wind carried a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper? No, more like a collection of whispers. Fragments of conversations lost beneath the surface. I strained my ears, trying to understand. Help us. Still here. Don't forget. Voices. Fragmented. Desperate. Official records claimed 117 people died during the Great Flood. But locals always suspected the number was higher. Much higher. My professional training fought against the growing sense of unease. Document. Observe. Stay rational. But something fundamental was shifting. The boundary between what I knew and what I was experiencing was becoming dangerously thin. A sudden cold breeze brushed against my neck. Not the natural movement of air, but something deliberate. Calculated. I spun around, heart racing, but saw only the endless gray landscape. Then I noticed it. A small movement in a second-floor window of an old brick building. A pale face. No, not a face. A suggestion of a face. Watching me. Just watching. The water below seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat, like a memory struggling to be heard. Something was waiting. Something wanted to be remembered. And I had a feeling my arrival was exactly what it had been waiting for. The local historical society was a small, water-damaged building that seemed to lean sideways, as if exhausted by its own memories. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten documents, photographs bleached by time and moisture. I spread my research materials across a rickety table. Newspaper clippings, flood reports, geological surveys. Each document told a fragment of Riverside's story, but something always felt missing. Old photographs showed a vibrant community. Children playing in streets now buried under meters of water. Families standing proud in front of homes that no longer existed. Each image felt like a whispered secret. A sudden rustling made me look up. No wind. No open windows. Just movement among the dusty files. Papers shifted. Not randomly. Deliberately. As if something or someone was searching. My hands trembled slightly as I reached out. The top page of an old flood report had moved. Partially uncovered was a name I hadn't seen before, Margaret Holloway. A name with no context, no explanation. When I tried to pull the document closer, it resisted. Like invisible fingers were holding it in place. "Stop it," I muttered to myself. "You're a professional. Imagination serves documentary, not fiction." But the papers continued to move. Outside, the floodwaters seemed to rise imperceptibly. Inch by slow, deliberate inch. Something wanted to be discovered. Something needed to be told. And I was beginning to understand that my documentary was no longer just about environmental tragedy. It was about something far more complex, far more haunting. Night in a flooded town is not silence. It's a symphony of impossible sounds. Water lapping against abandoned structures. Distant echoes of conversations never finished. The soft, rhythmic pulse of something breathing beneath the surface. I had set up my temporary living space in an old waterfront warehouse, converted into a makeshift studio. Waterproof equipment. Multiple cameras. Recording devices strategically placed to capture any anomaly. Professional protocol. Rational approach. But rationality was becoming a thin veneer. The warehouse creaked constantly. Not with the natural sounds of an old building settling, but with deliberate, measured movements. As if something was walking through the rooms when I wasn't looking. Exploring. Watching. My research on Margaret Holloway had uncovered fragments. She was an environmental scientist decades ago. Brilliant. Controversial. The one who had first warned about the potential flooding that would devastate Riverside. Nobody had listened. Her research notebooks, which I discovered buried in the Historical Society's archives, were filled with increasingly frantic notes. Mathematical calculations. Climate models. Predictions that seemed impossible at the time. But now, terrifyingly accurate. Around midnight, the first recording captured something unexpected. Voices. Fragments. Whispers that didn't belong to any living person. "We're still here. Waiting. Remember us." The voices weren't threatening. They were desperate. Pleading. My hand shook as I reviewed the audio. Professional equipment. Calibrated microphones. No external interference. These sounds came from inside the warehouse, from the water itself. Outside, the floodwaters continued to rise. Slowly, deliberately. Margaret's final notebook entry haunted me, written just weeks before the catastrophic flood. They are waiting. The waters remember. And one day, they will speak. What did she know? What had she discovered that drove her to write such cryptic messages? The recordings continued, hour after hour, voice after voice, a chorus of memories trapped between water and oblivion. Something was gathering, collecting, preparing, and I was becoming less certain with each passing moment that this was just a documentary about environmental tragedy. This was something else entirely. Water has memory. Not the scientific understanding of molecular structures, but something deeper, something primordial. A memory that retains trauma, preserves pain, holds on to unfinished stories. By the fourth day of my investigation, the line between documentation and survival had blurred completely. The voices grew stronger, more insistent. My equipment began capturing impossible imagery. Faces formed in water droplets, shadows moving against natural physics, reflections that showed events from decades past. I discovered more about Margaret Holloway. She wasn't just a forgotten scientist. She was a prophet, a witness to something far beyond environmental predictions. Her research suggested that water was more than a physical substance. It was a carrier of memory, of collective trauma, of unresolved human experiences. The town's geological records, combined with Margaret's personal notes, painted a disturbing picture. Riverside wasn't just a victim of climate change. It was a focal point of something much larger. Interviews with longtime residents revealed strange patterns. Floods that didn't follow natural cycles. Water that seemed to move with purpose. Sounds heard beneath the surface. It's like the river has a mind of its own, one elderly resident told me, his voice trembling. Sometimes it feels like it's remembering. My cameras captured anomalies that defied explanation. Water droplets forming shapes, shadows moving independently, reflections showing events that never happened, or perhaps events that happened long ago. The voices were gathering, collecting, preparing. For what? The water continued to rise, slowly, deliberately. And I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a flood. This was about justice, about memory, about a collective experience so profound it transcended individual lives. Water remembers everything. In the final moments of my investigation, everything changed. The voices consolidated. The fragments became a chorus. A collective memory demanding recognition. Margaret Holloway wasn't just a forgotten scientist. She was a witness, a prophet. Her original research had predicted not just environmental collapse, but something more profound. A collective trauma so deep it transcended individual lives. The flood wasn't an accident. It was a message. From whom? From the land itself. From collective human negligence. From forgotten warnings. As water levels rose around my makeshift research station, I understood the true nature of my documentary. This wasn't a story about environmental disaster. This was a story about collective memory. About voices silenced. About warnings unheeded. The faces in the water looked at me, not with anger, with understanding. They had waited, preserved, remembered, and now they wanted the world to know. The flood was just the beginning. A revelation was coming, a reckoning, and I was the messenger. It's strange, isn't it? How silence can be so loud. I remember walking through the dimly lit halls of the museum that night, feeling the weight of history pressing down on my shoulders. I could hear my footsteps echoing, the only sound in the stillness, except for the occasional soft creak of the old floorboards beneath me. The museum was like a mausoleum of forgotten lives. Ancient artifacts were scattered throughout the exhibit, each one holding the secrets of the past. Some were beautiful, others unsettling in their age, as if they had lived through centuries of human struggle and triumph. But none of it mattered, at least not until that night. It had all started with an odd sensation in my chest, like something heavy was sitting there, squeezing the air from my lungs. I couldn't shake it, not even when I tried to ignore it. I was alone in the museum. The night shift was always quiet, a strange solitude that settled in, where the only company was the relics and the faint hum of the old heating system. But this night was different. It wasn't just the silence. There was something else. I walked past an ancient sword, its silver blade dull with age, its hilt wrapped in centuries-old leather. The room was cold, but I felt an odd warmth at the back of my neck, like someone was standing just behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Only the darkened exhibits surrounded me, frozen in time. Then it came, just a whisper at first, so soft I thought I imagined it. A sigh. A faint breath, a breath from somewhere ancient. And then, the shadows in the corners of the room, they moved. No, that wasn't right. Shadows didn't move like that. They didn't stretch and writhe as if they had a mind of their own. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, the dim lighting distorting the edges of the exhibits. But as I stepped closer to the wall, the shadows didn't change. They didn't behave like shadows should. They lingered, twisting in odd, unnatural ways. It was then that I noticed the faint smell. Something metallic. Something wrong. I turned and quickly made my way to the next room, trying to push away the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. But the quiet was unbearable. The stillness thickened, pressing in on me. I tried to focus on the next exhibit, an old, rusted key from some forgotten era, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the shadows, to the sensation that something was waiting for me in the dark. It was when I walked past the display of ancient pottery, cracked and faded from time, that I felt it. The breath. Close. So close, I could feel it on the back of my neck, icy against my skin. I spun around again, heart pounding, but again, the room was empty. The artifacts remained unmoved. Yet, there was something different in the air now. The tension, like a string pulled too tight, vibrated through the silence. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. That it was just my imagination, running wild with the loneliness of the night shift. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound. Slow, deliberate. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but I could hear it clear as day. Like something, or someone, was dragging its fingers along the glass cases, tapping softly on the cold, polished surface. I turned towards the sound, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. I took a cautious step forward, my heart thudding in my chest. My palms were clammy, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The scraping continued. It wasn't just a sound now, it was a presence, a growing weight in the room that filled every corner, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt it again, the strange warmth at the back of my neck. Something behind me. But there was nothing there. Just the shadows. Just the darkness. I reached for my phone, needing to break the silence, needing to hear something familiar. But the screen flickered before it went black. Panic. It hit me then. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but the handle, it wouldn't turn. It was as if the museum itself was holding me in place. I stepped back, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm the surge of fear flooding my mind. That's why I saw it. The shadow in the far corner. It wasn't like the others. It was thicker, darker. It moved. Not like a shadow moves, but as though it were breathing, expanding, growing. I stood frozen, unable to look away. The figure, if you could call it that, seemed to sway in the darkness, its edges flickering like the dying flame of a candle. Then, I heard it. A voice. Low, almost a growl, as if it were speaking from the depths of the earth itself. You shouldn't be here. I don't remember much after that. I remember the walls closing in, the shadows pulling at me, the cold breath brushing my face. And then, darkness. When I awoke, the darkness was suffocating. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, minutes, hours, maybe days. My body felt stiff, like I'd been lying on stone for an eternity. The air smelled heavy, thick with dust and mildew, as though the room hadn't been disturbed in centuries. My head was spinning, my vision blurred. Slowly, I sat up, fighting the panic that threatened to rise in my chest. The museum. I was still in the museum. But something was wrong. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The floor beneath me was cold, slick with some unfamiliar residue. I pulled myself to my feet, trembling. The room looked different now, more distorted, as if the world had shifted when I wasn't looking. The walls seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching impossibly far, twisting unnaturally. I glanced at the exhibits. Nothing had moved. Nothing, except for the way the dim light seemed to flicker, the shadows crawling along the floor as though alive. I shook my head, forcing myself to think clearly. Then I heard it again. A faint sound, just like before. The soft scrape of something against the glass cases. But this time, it wasn't just a noise. It was a whisper, a voice carried by the wind. Come closer. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My mouth went dry. There was no one here. I was alone. But the voice, it felt real. It felt like it was coming from inside my head. I took a step back, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to circle around me, as if it were moving through the walls, through the very air itself. You have to see it. You have to understand. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was something more, something that twisted my thoughts, made them unravel. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my feet refused to move. I was trapped. Trapped in this place that seemed to be breathing, alive with something ancient and terrible. I turned to the nearest exhibit, my gaze falling on a dusty old mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The glass was cracked, shattered in places, but it was the reflection that sent a chill down my spine. There, standing just behind me, was a figure. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. I went back to the mirror. The figure was still there. It was a silhouette, dark and shapeless, but somehow familiar. It was as though the reflection was mocking me, showing me something I couldn't understand. You see me, don't you? The voice again. Clearer now. A whisper, but full of weight, full of menace. It came from the figure, from the thing in the mirror that wasn't a reflection. It was real. It was watching me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Who are you? The words barely escaped my mouth, trembling with fear. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Then the figure in the mirror grinned. A wide, sickening grin that stretched too far across its face, too wide for a human mouth. Its eyes were dark voids, empty, but they seemed to pull at me, draw me in. I couldn't look away. Come closer, little one, it said, the voice now like a rasping breath, as though it had crawled from the very depths of the earth. There's so much you don't know. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of an exhibit case. The glass rattled. I had to get out. Had to run. The doors. The exit. My only way out. I turned and bolted toward the door, heart racing, hands shaking as I grabbed the handle. But it wouldn't open. It wouldn't even budge. I pulled again, harder this time, but the door was locked. The museum was sealed shut. You can't leave. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was everywhere. It filled the room, vibrating through the walls, wrapping itself around me like chains. I pounded on the door. Let me out. Please. My voice cracked, breaking under the weight of fear. A deep laugh echoed from the shadows, the kind of laugh that sent a cold shiver down your spine. You're already here. You've always been here. I spun around. The room seemed to pulse, as though the very walls were alive, breathing in time with my panic. And then, there it was again, movement in the corner of my vision. A figure. Tall. Lean. It moved with unnatural grace, slipping in and out of the shadows, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. I could hear the scrape of its feet on the floor, slow, deliberate. My eyes locked on it, my breath stuck in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. It stepped into the dim light. It was human, or at least, it looked human. But its skin was too pale, too stretched, as though it had been pulled too tight across its bones. Its face was hollow, its eyes black holes that seemed to stare right through me. Its lips were pulled back in that same grotesque smile. Do you know why you're here? The thing asked, its voice low and rasping. It didn't sound human. It sounded like something ancient. Something that had been waiting for this moment. I wanted to scream. To run. To escape. But all I could do was stare. It had me in its grip. I was frozen, my mind screaming for me to move, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. You have to understand, it whispered. The past doesn't die. It waits. It waits for the living to remember. And then, with a movement too fast for my eyes to follow, the figure was gone. The shadows swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but an echo of its voice in the silence. You'll see. You'll understand soon enough. I was alone again. But not really. Not anymore. The walls seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing from every angle. And in the distance, I could still hear the scraping sound, the sound of something moving in the darkness. Watching. Waiting. The silence that followed was deafening. It wrapped around me like a thick, suffocating blanket, so heavy it pressed against my chest. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, but I couldn't seem to calm myself. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but the words died on my tongue. I turned in circles, searching for any sign of the thing that had spoken to me. But the room was as empty as it had been before. No figure. No presence. Only the oppressive shadows and the hum of the old museum. I ran a trembling hand through my hair, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. No, I whispered to myself. This isn't real. It can't be real. But deep down, I knew it was. I could feel it, something darker, something ancient, was here with me. Something that had been waiting. Watching. Waiting for me. Get a grip, I muttered, wiping the sweat from my brow. The words didn't even sound convincing in my own ears. How could I get a grip when everything around me seemed to be coming apart at the seams? I forced myself to walk forward, back towards the hallway, towards the other exhibits. I could almost hear the echoes of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, just out of reach. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, desperate to find something, anything, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. The dim lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The museum had never felt like this before. It had always been quiet, quiet in the way an old building is quiet, not in the way that something alive is quiet. A cold gust of air swept through the corridor, making me shiver. I turned to look toward the window, but it was covered in thick, dark curtains. No wind should have come through, not here. The sound of a door creaking open. My pulse leapt. Something was here. I couldn't stop myself. My feet carried me toward the sound before my mind could catch up. I rounded the corner, my breath catching in my throat when I saw what was waiting. It was a woman. She stood near one of the exhibits, her back to me. Long black hair hung in loose waves around her shoulders, but the rest of her posture, was wrong. Too still. Too rigid. She was wearing a tattered dress, one that looked older than any clothing I had ever seen. The fabric was dark, torn in places, frayed around the edges. And her skin was pale, almost translucent. I stepped back, but the floorboard creaked beneath my foot. She spun around so quickly, I almost didn't have time to react. Her face, God, her face was like something out of a nightmare. Hollow cheeks, lips too thin, eyes wide and vacant, a deep, endless black. The air seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water into the room. I took a step back, my throat tightening. "Who are you?" I asked, the words barely escaping my lips. Her eyes didn't blink. They only stared, unblinking, unfeeling. "I was once like you," she said, her voice soft but filled with something ancient. Something sorrowful, yet dark. But I remember it all now. "What do you want from me?" My voice was barely a whisper, drowned in fear. "You came," she murmured, taking a slow, unsteady step toward me. "You came to see the truth. To learn that time does not forget." Her words cut through the air, slicing into my chest like cold steel. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. "No," I whispered, I didn't come for this. I came to work. I was just doing my job. The woman's face twisted into a smile that was both pitiful and terrifying. You don't get to choose that, she said. Her voice grew louder, a rising storm of words, as if she were not just speaking to me, but to the entire museum. No one chooses. Time chooses. And time remembers. She reached out, her fingers twitching unnaturally, her nails long and sharp, like claws, and I took a stumbling step back. Stop! I cried, my voice cracking. I turned and ran, not thinking, just moving, my feet pounding against the cold stone floor. The museum stretched on, endless, its dark corridors shifting as though it were alive and eager to trap me. But I could hear her behind me. The woman. Her soft, slow footsteps echoed like a heartbeat, growing louder and louder with each passing moment. You can't escape, she called, her voice rising to a high-pitched screech that echoed in my mind. We are all trapped here, bound to the past, to the things we cannot forget. I rounded a corner, my breath ragged, my mind spinning. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out and reaching for me, pulling me toward them. My eyes flicked to the nearest exhibit, a dusty relic, something ancient and forgotten. It was a book, bound in dark leather, its cover etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Something about it called to me. I reached for it, trembling, my fingers brushing the cover. The moment I touched it, the air around me seemed to grow colder. The shadows deepened, and the woman's voice reached a new pitch, a maddened screech that reverberated through my skull. I told you, you can't escape. Suddenly, the book snapped open in my hands, the pages turning by themselves, as if someone, was controlling it. The words on the pages weren't in any language I recognized, but the moment I laid eyes on them, my head spun. My thoughts twisted. Images flashed before my eyes, images of the past. Images of suffering, death, horror. The woman's image appeared again, her twisted face staring at me from the pages, her voice now a distorted chant in my ears. This is the price. The price of remembering. The museum trembled, as though the very walls were breathing. I could feel the floor beneath me shift, the building groaning, its ancient bones creaking under the weight of something far darker than I could comprehend. And then, everything went black. I awoke in a cold sweat. My eyes snapped open, but the world was still dark. My body felt heavy, weighed down by some unseen force. My mind was slow to catch up, as though it had been submerged underwater for far too long. I was lying on something hard, cold stone, I realized. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting as I sat up. The museum. I was still in the museum, I thought with a sense of dread. But something was different. I glanced around. The once familiar hallway stretched before me, but the air was thick and stifling. The shadows were deeper now, almost suffocating, as though they were trying to swallow me whole. The dim light that had once flickered on the walls had dimmed further, casting everything into a murky gloom. It was as if the very essence of the building had shifted, as though the museum itself had become something more, something alive. And I was its prey. I stood shakily, my feet unsteady beneath me. The familiar surroundings, displays of ancient relics, jars filled with brittle bones, withered statues of forgotten gods, seemed to distort in the gloom, their shapes becoming grotesque and unnatural. The once innocent artifacts now appeared to have an aura of malevolence about them, their surfaces slick with age, their edges sharp and unnerving. The book. I looked down at my hands, which were trembling violently. They were still clutching the leather-bound tome, the one that had opened by itself. The pages fluttered slightly as if caught by some unseen breeze, though the air around me was still. My heart raced as I held it, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The weight of it, both physical and mental, anchored me in this forsaken place. Then I heard it again, the whisper. Soft at first, like a breath barely there. You shouldn't have opened it. I froze, my heart stopping for a brief moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. This time, the voice was unmistakably clear, low, almost a growl, but thick with an ancient power that reverberated through my chest. The voice came from somewhere ahead. I wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just the echoes in my head, but I couldn't ignore it. Who's there? I demanded, my voice wavering despite my best effort to sound strong. Show yourself. The shadows seemed to shift in response to my words, swirling like smoke, as though the very darkness around me had come alive. I swallowed hard, the air feeling thick and suffocating in my lungs. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. I couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman at first. Their features were obscured by the shadows, and they moved with a peculiar fluidity, as though they were part of the dark itself. A chill ran down my spine. The figure's face was completely hidden, a featureless mask of pure blackness that seemed to absorb all light. The figure took a slow step toward me. I instinctively took a step back, my feet tripping over the jagged stone of the floor. You've read it, haven't you? The figure spoke again, its voice a soft rasp, like the sound of nails scraping against a chalkboard. You've awakened the past. The words felt heavy, the weight of them pressing down on me. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. I didn't mean to. I don't understand. What is this place? This place is where time rots, the voice answered, its tone distant, as if it were speaking from some faraway realm. The figure took another step closer, its form casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Where memories live and nightmares never die. The museum holds them all, every soul that has touched it, every shadow that has passed through its halls. Time is not a straight line, you see. It is a spiral. And you, little one, have stumbled into its depths. I took another step back, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. My mind was a whirl of confusion, struggling to process the impossibility of the situation. The depths of time. I had heard those words before, in the strange whispers that clung to the edges of my thoughts. Was it the book? Was it the museum? What had I unleashed? I looked at the figure, trying to make sense of its shifting shape. It was like it wasn't entirely real. It was less than real. Just a distortion in the air, an imprint of something that should have stayed buried. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice trembling despite myself. The figure tilted its head slightly, its faceless form regarding me with an eerie stillness. I don't want anything from you, child. The voice seemed to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the dark. It is you who has come for me. You who have stirred what was never meant to be stirred. I staggered backward, my feet hitting something hard and metal. I looked down and saw that I was standing in front of an old display case, a relic of some long-forgotten age. The glass was cracked, and within it there was something alive. I leaned closer, peering through the shards of broken glass. Inside was a figure, another figure, small, hunched, with long, spindly arms and legs. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, greenish light. Before I could react, the figure in the shadows reached out, its hand moving too fast to follow, grabbing hold of my wrist with an inhuman strength. The coldness of its touch sent a shock through my body, and I gasped, trying to pull away, but it was like the hand was made of ice. "Do you understand now?" the voice hissed, its presence pressing against me from all sides. "Time is a prison, and we are all its prisoners." Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, then went out completely, plunging the museum into darkness. "And now, you are mine." The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of footsteps, too many footsteps, slowly drawing closer. I woke to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, just a whisper of noise, barely perceptible, but then it grew louder. Each tap felt like a hammer striking against the walls of my skull. My head throbbed, a dull pain spreading through my temples, as though my very thoughts were being crushed beneath something heavy, something relentless. I opened my eyes. The room was cold, darker than before. The shadows, if they were even shadows, moved in strange, slithering patterns across the floor, crawling over the artifacts, creeping along the walls. I could feel them, as though the darkness itself were alive, watching me. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to obey. My limbs felt like they were made of lead, stiff and unyielding. My fingers twitched involuntarily, and I found myself gripping the floor beneath me, as if to anchor myself to something real. I needed to focus. I needed to understand what was happening. The tapping grew louder still, echoing around the room. My gaze fell upon a figure standing at the far end of the chamber. It was not the shadowed figure from before, but something else. A man. Tall, hunched, with skin so pale it almost seemed to glow in the dark. His face was gaunt, sharp, as if he had not seen the sun in decades or centuries. His eyes, though, were the most disturbing. They were wide, unblinking, and empty. There was nothing behind them. Only the void. The man was staring directly at me, his lips twitching as though he were about to speak. But no sound came. I wanted to scream, but the words died in my throat. A deep, unnatural silence hung in the air, broken only by that incessant tapping, now more pronounced, more deliberate. It was coming from the man. The sound seemed to emanate from his very bones, each movement of his hand sending a shockwave through the air. Tap. 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 I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse and raw. "What do you want from me?" I asked, the question more of a desperate plea than a demand. The man tilted his head slowly, like a bird eyeing its prey. His lips curled into the slightest of smiles, one that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without a word, he raised a skeletal finger to his lips. His nails, long and cracked, scraped against his skin, producing an unsettling sound that sent chills down my spine. S-H-H-H-H. The darkness seemed to stretch in response to his gesture, growing thicker, more suffocating. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me from all sides. It was as though the room itself was closing in, its walls shifting, bending in ways that defied logic. The very air grew heavier, denser, until it felt like I was breathing through wet cloth. "Please," I whispered, more to myself than to the figure, "what is this place? What have I done?" His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, narrowed slightly. A cruel glint flickered in them, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like pity, a twisted, malevolent sort of pity, before it vanished, replaced by that same hollow emptiness. "You opened it," the man finally spoke, his voice a rasp, like the sound of 1,000 dying whispers. "And in doing so, you have given it life again." What? I choked, my throat dry, my heart racing. What does that mean? What have I awakened? The tapping stopped. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then the man's head tilted back in a slow, deliberate motion, his lips parting as if savoring the taste of the words he was about to speak. This place, he said, his voice lowering to a near inaudible murmur, was never meant to be. It is a cage, a prison that time has forgotten. The souls bound within it, they were meant to stay forgotten. But you, little one, you have broken the lock. And now, we are all free. I swallowed hard, the words crawling through my mind like cold fingers scraping along my spine. Free? I repeated, trying to understand. You mean, this place is alive? The museum, it's not just a building? The man's smile widened, though it was no less unsettling. Oh, it is not just a building, he said, his voice thick with something akin to reverence. It is time itself. A broken fragment of history, a piece of the past that should never have been unearthed. And now that it is, it will consume you, just as it has consumed the others before you. I took an unsteady step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Others? What do you mean? Who else is here? He stepped closer, his bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. His breath was cold, his presence suffocating, as though the very air around him had become ice. You have already met one of them, he said, his voice sharp. The woman you saw earlier. The one whose face you can never forget. She was the first. My mind reeled as I remembered the sight of her, the hollow, empty eyes, the tattered dress, her voice that had come from some other place, some other time. I started, but the words caught in my throat. She is what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, the man continued. And now, you will become like her. Another lost soul, wandering in this cage forever, forgotten by time, cursed to walk these halls until nothing but dust remains. No, I gasped, stumbling backward. No, I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. The man's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. You didn't have to ask. You simply had to open it. I turned on my heel, my legs shaking beneath me. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But the darkness was closing in, creeping toward me from every direction, swallowing up the space between us, making it impossible to see beyond the walls of my own fear. The museum wasn't just a building. It was the embodiment of every nightmare, every tragedy, every forgotten soul. The man's laughter echoed through the void, his voice a haunting, hollow sound. And now, he said softly, you belong to it. Have you ever felt something watching you when there's no one there? The kind of gaze that makes your skin crawl, prickles spreading across your body as if invisible eyes are tracing your every move? I have. And it hasn't stopped since I entered the old hotel. I never expected to find myself at the Crestwood Inn, not in a place like this, isolated, tucked away on the edge of nowhere, where the land ends and the forest presses against the very walls. The windows, clouded with dust, let in only a trickle of light, the sun barely managing to cut through the grime. The smell of stale wood and dampness clung to everything. The inn felt like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something still alive in the walls. Something lurking. I arrived a week ago, seeking solitude, just a few days to recharge my weary mind after months of relentless work. I didn't think it would be anything more than a quiet retreat in a forgotten corner of the world. But the place has a way of getting under your skin. I should have left the moment I saw the faded sign by the road, the one that read, Crestwood Inn, a place of peace in peeling letters. But something kept me there. The charm of the place, perhaps. Or maybe the need for an escape from everything and everyone. A break from the constant noise of the city. The first night, I noticed the noise. It was subtle at first, a soft creaking from somewhere deep within the building, the kind you might brush off as the house settling. But by the third night, I was no longer able to ignore it. The creaks became louder, more deliberate. A step, then another. I was not alone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was the wind, the old structure groaning under the weight of its history. But then, I saw her. The figure. It was just a glimpse, a shadow, but it was enough to make my blood freeze. She appeared at the edge of the hallway just beyond the stairwell, her face hidden beneath a veil of long, black hair. I couldn't see her clearly, only the silhouette of a woman standing unnervingly still, as though waiting for me to notice her. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But the feeling, that sensation of being watched, lingered. I didn't sleep that night. And I didn't tell anyone. The next morning, I tried to shrug it off. The innkeeper, an elderly man named Mr. Holloway, greeted me with a cup of coffee as usual. His wrinkled face cracked into a smile, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow, something he wasn't saying. He was polite, distant, but his voice had a tremor to it when he spoke of the history of the inn. People come and go, he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Not many stay long, though, and fewer still return. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed he was just being odd, an old man stuck in his ways. But there was something off about him. Something unnatural about the way he moved, as if his joints creaked just a bit too loudly for a man of his age. By the third night, the strange noises had escalated. I could hear footsteps now, coming from the hallway outside my room. Slow, measured steps, like someone walking with deliberate care. But when I opened the door, no one was there. It wasn't just the noises anymore. I started seeing her, the woman. At first, it was fleeting. A blur in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in the hallway. But as the days wore on, she grew bolder. She stood there, in the doorway of my room, her figure barely visible in the low light. She never spoke, just stood motionless, watching. I could feel her presence, the coldness that seemed to emanate from her, and I would turn away, pretending I hadn't seen anything at all. But I couldn't stop myself from looking. Each time, her form became clearer, more distinct. I began to make out the details. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and vacant. And there were marks, lines, across her face, etched deep into her skin, as if she had been weeping for years, her tears carving into her flesh like rivers. I remember the first time I tried to speak to her. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking, though I didn't want it to. "Why are you here?" She didn't answer, of course. She never did. I reached out, desperate, but she disappeared as quickly as she had come, vanishing into the shadows of the hallway, like smoke dissipating into the air. But as the door closed behind me, I saw it, the faint outline of something new. A mark on the wall, just above the handle. Something that hadn't been there before. A trail of what looked like dark, wet stains. Blood? Tears? I couldn't tell. It was as though her very presence had left its mark on the walls. The next night, I couldn't sleep. The pressure in my chest was too much. The oppressive air around me grew thicker with every passing hour. The walls seemed to close in. The creaks in the hallway were louder, the footsteps more pronounced. I couldn't escape her. The woman. The ghost of the forgotten traveler. I didn't know who she was, why she was haunting me. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something terrible had happened here. I was certain of it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was not just a witness to her haunting. I was part of it. The question gnawed at me, growing in my mind like a festering wound. What happened to her? And why was I the one to see her now? The night had swallowed the last of the light when I first heard it, soft at first, like the distant rustling of leaves. But then it grew louder. A whisper. It crawled through the cracks in the walls, as if the very building itself was speaking, murmuring to me. I lay in bed, tense, frozen under the weight of that voice. My heart beat in time with the rhythm of it, as if the pulse of the house had synchronized with my own. Help me. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was her. I could hear the floorboards creak underfoot, the whispering just behind the thin veil of the walls. Please. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a low thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I pushed the blankets aside, my legs shaking as I stood. I grabbed the handle of the door, my pulse thudding in my neck. I had to know. I had to understand. When I stepped into the hallway, a chill rushed over me, colder than the night air outside. My breath clouded before me, visible in the darkness. I reached for the light switch, but my fingers brushed against the cold plaster wall, wet. I froze. The wall was damp, as though it had been exposed to the rain. But that was impossible. No rain had fallen in days. The air was still, the storm outside long gone. I pulled my hand back, staring at the smear of moisture. It was thick, glistening. It looked like blood. A dark, inky red streak marked the wall, jagged and uneven. My stomach turned. What was this? Why had no one mentioned anything about the stains? Why hadn't anyone noticed before? The air felt heavier now, suffocating. I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. The same rhythm as before. As if someone was walking behind me, just out of sight. I turned to face the hallway, my breath shallow, my hand gripping the doorframe. The faint outline of a figure stood at the far end of the hall. Her presence was like a shadow that consumed the light. She's here. I stepped forward, almost against my will, my feet moving faster than my thoughts. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge me. It stood there, frozen, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to reach it. Then the voice again, closer this time. Why are you running? I flinched, but my feet kept moving, drawn forward like a moth to a flame. My mind screamed at me to stop, but the words, the whispers, pulled me deeper into the maze of the hotel. It felt like I was walking through a dream, unreal, and yet the coldness, the weight, the very air pressing against me, all felt far too real. The figure at the end of the hall began to take shape. Slowly. Excruciatingly slowly. The shadows around her shifted, and there she was, the woman. Her face was pale, the skin stretched thin over her bones, her features sharp and angular. Her eyes, wide and hollow, fixed on me. I felt her gaze crawl into my skin, burrowing into my thoughts. The dark stains on her face, tears or blood, I couldn't tell, formed tracks down her cheeks, pooling at her chin. The floor around her was slick with something dark, something foul. Her dress was torn at the hem, the fabric tattered and worn. It hung from her frame like a ghostly shroud. And she was barefoot, her feet leaving prints on the wet floor as she moved toward me. "Please, help me." Her voice was like a broken echo, muffled by the walls, yet it felt as though it was coming from the very air around me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, barely a whisper, but it felt loud in the suffocating silence. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes held a sadness so deep, so eternal, that it made my chest ache. "Why are you here?" I asked again, taking a hesitant step forward. My pulse was racing, and my legs trembled as I reached out a hand. She didn't flinch, didn't move as my fingers brushed against her cold, damp skin. In that moment, I felt it, the weight of her presence, the history of her pain. It pressed down on me, a suffocating blanket of sorrow and anger, as though her spirit were bound to this place, trapped in the very walls. I pulled my hand back, gasping for air. This wasn't right. None of it was. The woman, still silent, took a step toward me, and my heart pounded harder in my chest. Her feet made no sound on the floor, but I could feel her approach. "You shouldn't have come here." Her words were softer now, but they stung like icy needles in my brain. I stepped back, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Who is she? What happened to her? I couldn't look away. Her eyes, they held something I couldn't understand. A question, perhaps? A plea? As if sensing my confusion, the woman's gaze flickered toward the hallway, her attention shifting towards something unseen, something beyond my reach. And that's when I noticed it, the marks on the walls, the strange symbols. They weren't just bloodstains. They were messages. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood, the marks formed crude shapes, lines, circles, and jagged patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Some were words, some were symbols. None of them made sense. But they were real. Too real. I stared at the wall beside her, my eyes widening as I deciphered the last one. "Help me, escape." Suddenly, the air turned colder, and I could see my breath cloud in the dim light. The woman was no longer in front of me. She had vanished, but her presence lingered in the space where she had stood. The whispering started again, louder this time, like a storm of voices, all speaking in fragments. "You've opened the door. You can't leave now." I spun around, my mind scrambling, my legs moving on their own accord. But there was no escape. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls bending and warping, the very foundation of the hotel groaning as though it were alive. The sounds grew louder, deafening now. The footsteps, the whispers, the cries. They surrounded me, pressing in from all directions. The walls seemed to pulse with the noise, the darkness wrapping itself around me like a suffocating shroud. And then, I saw it, beneath the layers of dust, behind a cracked painting, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, barely noticeable, but the light flickered dimly through the cracks. Something was waiting behind it. The woman's voice whispered again, closer this time. "You found it." The door, barely noticeable in the dark corridor, called to me. It wasn't the door that made it so strange, it was what lay behind it, what might be behind it. The whispering voices, the shadows dancing just beyond the reach of the light, made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something in the air was different now, thick with the weight of unseen eyes, like the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. My feet moved of their own accord as I stepped toward it. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But curiosity, the nagging pull of unanswered questions, had taken root in my chest, and it was too strong now to ignore. I reached the door, the wood smooth and cold beneath my fingers. It was old, ancient even, and the hinges looked rusted, as if they hadn't been disturbed in years, decades, perhaps. My breath fogged up the air in front of me as I leaned in closer. I could feel a pull, like an invisible thread wrapped around my chest, urging me onward. The whispers, those whispers, were louder now, swirling like a storm around me. Open it. You have to open it. I couldn't make out the voices. Were there more now? But the tone was unmistakable, a mixture of fear, desperation, and anger. A warning. A plea. It was hard to tell where one began and the other ended, as though the very walls had begun to breathe in time with the voices. I knew then, I knew that whatever lay behind that door would change everything. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle. It groaned, its protests long buried in the crevices of the old wood. The door opened slowly, the hinges scraping in a sound that echoed far too loudly in the silence. And as the door creaked open, I stepped inside. I was hit with the scent of must and decay, thick and overwhelming. The room was suffocating in its stillness, the darkness pressing down on me. I could barely make out the outline of the walls, bare, barren, save for the small chest in the far corner. The air was heavy, laden with the weight of secrets long buried. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I took a cautious step forward. My heart pounded in my chest. My hand, trembling, reached out to touch the chest. It was wooden, old, intricately carved. The designs were faded, worn with age, but there was something almost familiar about them. As if I had seen them before, but where? In the corner of my mind, I felt the faintest trace of memory stir, like a shadow brushing against the edges of my thoughts. Before I could open it, the whispering began again, louder this time. Closer. I turned, the room around me seemingly shrinking as the shadows stretched and twisted. I could feel them, pressing in on all sides. My breath was shallow now, my hands slick with sweat. And then, I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the chest. The light from the hallway cast just enough illumination for me to see her, the woman. She was standing perfectly still, her face half hidden in shadow, her gaze fixed on me with that same, cold, dead stare. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. Something more desperate, more frantic. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Help me. The voice was raw, like the last breath of a dying soul. A sound that reverberated deep within my bones, as though it had come from the very foundations of the building itself. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. The chill clung to my skin like ice, seeping into my bones. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by the weight of her gaze. Her face, a face once beautiful, now hollow, gaunt, was painted with sorrow, her skin stretched thin, and beneath her eyes, dark bruises bloomed like shadows that consumed her once lively features. She took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The dampness in the room thickened, and I could feel the stench of death, of decay, wafting toward me. Her eyes widened, and she reached out with trembling hands, as though begging for something, anything, her voice cracked and broken, her form wavering like a reflection on the surface of water. "Please, don't leave me here." The words hit me like a physical blow, and something inside me cracked. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't leave her there. Not with that haunting plea hanging in the air. Not with that sorrow filling the room, heavy as the stone walls that surrounded us. Her fingers reached toward me, slow and deliberate, and I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was as if I was caught in a trance, unable to break free from the pull of her presence. I took a step forward, just one step, compelled, drawn to her. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her eyes flashed with a mix of fear and confusion, but she didn't answer. She couldn't answer. The temperature in the room dropped even further. My breath came in visible bursts, fogging the air in front of me. And then, suddenly, a loud thud sounded from behind me, somewhere deep within the inn. The room, the air, shuddered. The woman's eyes darted to the chest, to the dark shape looming in the corner of the room. And then, as if on cue, a faint, grinding sound echoed from inside the chest. It was as though something was trying to force its way out. The floor beneath me groaned, and the walls cracked with the sound of old wood splitting. The whispering started again, louder, more frantic. "You've opened it." The chest. I turned to look, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The lid of the chest lifted, inch by inch, a sliver of darkness peeking through. I could feel something dark, something ancient, stirring inside, as if it had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to open it. The woman's form flickered, fading in and out like a broken signal. "Don't," I whispered, but it was too late. The chest was wide open now, and whatever was inside, whatever had been sealed away for so long, was coming out. I backed away, my legs stumbling against the wooden floor. The darkness in the chest seemed to reach out like a living thing, curling around the edges of the room, thick and suffocating. And then I saw it. A shadow. No, not a shadow, a figure. A mass, a shape that moved like liquid. It reached out toward me, its form shifting and writhing in the darkness, and I understood then, with a sickening clarity, that this was no ordinary ghost. It was something older, something far worse. And it was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The air was suffocating, pressing against my chest, forcing the air out of my lungs as the shadow, that thing, slithered closer. It was not a shape that could be described by mere words, too fluid, too unnatural. The darkness it emitted seemed to bend the very space around it, distorting the walls and floor, and for a moment I felt as though I was trapped in the very fabric of a nightmare, unable to escape. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest, but my feet, heavy, sluggish, refused to obey. My mind raced, desperate for an answer, for any escape, but it was like the very room was twisting, contorting, closing in on me. I could feel it. The presence of the thing in the chest had suddenly filled the entire room, every corner, every crack, with a malignant force. The woman, the one who had pleaded with me to help, was gone. In her place, only the air remained, thick with a sense of something far older and darker than anything I had ever encountered. Her shadow lingered where she had stood, but it too was fading, dissipating, swallowed by the abyss that had been unleashed. I turned to the door. No, no, no! The door. It was gone. The doorway, the passage that had once been my escape, was now nothing but an indistinct blur. The frame melted away as if the entire structure of the inn itself was crumbling, erasing the boundaries between what was real and what was not. What was real? What was I even seeing? The thing in the chest, if it could be called a thing, continued to move. It watched me, though there were no eyes, no features that could be defined. But it knew me. It was aware of my every thought, every pulse of fear. The whispers grew louder again, closer. "Please, help me, he is coming." Her voice again, seemed to echo through the room, distorted now. Her plea was desperate, raw. But there was something more. Something else buried beneath her cries. A darkness that pressed against my skull, urging me to listen. But to what? What could she want now? I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to stave off the growing pressure, the weight of something that felt alive inside my head, swirling with each fragmented thought. It was as if the house itself was feeding on my terror, growing stronger by the second. And then I heard it. A sound that rose from deep within the floorboards, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Steps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Coming closer. My breath came out in shallow, panic bursts. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The room, the very air, seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. My legs were shaking, my hands clammy and cold. I could feel sweat pooling at the small of my back, despite the unnatural chill that had taken over. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the hollow air. The floor beneath me vibrated with each heavy step, as if something large, too large, was moving beneath the building. I could almost hear it now, breathing, a rasping, wet sound that sent shivers down my spine. Whatever it wasn't human. The footsteps, they weren't from someone walking. No, they were sliding, dragging something. Something heavy. I spun around in a frantic panic, my eyes searching the room, but there was nothing. No sign of the woman. No sign of anything but the impenetrable dark. Yet the sound of those steps persisted, growing ever nearer. Bang! A door slammed somewhere deep within the inn. The room trembled with the force, and I gasped, fear flooding my system like ice water. I wasn't alone. A whisper. Low. Soft. Behind you. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. But I knew. I knew the shadow had crept up behind me, drawn closer by the sound of my breath. A dark presence I could feel, like the weight of eyes watching me from within the abyss. Something brushed against my shoulder, ice cold and insistent. I spun around, hands reaching out instinctively, but there was nothing there. Except a face. It was there. Floating inches from mine. A woman's face. Twisted. Her skin pale and tight, stretched too thin over bones, her eyes, those eyes, wide and desperate, staring through me as though I were nothing more than a passing shadow. A murky gray film clung to her skin, the color of decayed flesh, her lips cracked and dry. But it was her eyes that haunted me. They glinted with something that no longer resembled humanity. Something empty. "Don't leave," she rasped, her voice a mere whisper, barely a sound. "I'm so alone." I opened my mouth to speak, to cry out for help, but nothing came. Only a strangled breath escaped my throat. The cold presence had grown more intense, as if the air itself was made of ice. And then, I saw it. A hand reaching from the darkness. Not the woman's hand, no. This one was far larger, far more monstrous. It was grotesque, blackened, with gnarled fingers tipped with jagged claws that scraped across the floor. The shadows seemed to gather around it, swirling in a sickening dance. I backed away, breath hitching in my throat. "No," I whispered, trembling. "Please. Not this." But the hand moved closer. Slowly. Relentlessly. And then, the silence shattered. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a deafening roar. The walls around me trembled, and I looked up to see the ceiling splintering. The very structure of the inn was breaking apart. It was as if everything was collapsing, folding in on itself, but from within, the thing beneath it all had been awakened. It moved, dark and infinite, too fast for my eyes to follow, engulfing everything in its wake. The shadows lashed out, biting at me, tearing at my skin, dragging me back, pulling me into its black maw. I'd fought, thrashing in the grip of something that wasn't just of this world. The hand was everywhere now, and with it came the scream, the cry of the thing that had been trapped here, feeding off the terror of everyone who had dared enter this forsaken place. And with that scream, the shadows closed in, and everything turned to black. I woke up with a start. My breath was ragged, lungs burning as though I had been submerged underwater for hours. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but everything around me felt wrong. The room I was in was familiar, but yet it wasn't. The walls, the ceiling, were distorted, as if viewed through the wrong end of a lens. The air was thick with dampness, and the faintest smell of rot clung to it, mixing with a bitter, metallic tang. I was no longer in the hallway. The room I found myself in was dark, almost impossibly dark, as though light itself had been consumed by the shadows. The faint echoes of a whisper slid through my mind, muffled but insistent. "Come closer." I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. My limbs were stiff, as though I had been lying on the cold stone floor for hours, maybe days. I looked around in panic, struggling to push back the fog that clung to my mind. But where was I? Was it a dream? No. I knew better than that. This was real. I stood up shakily, trying to get my bearings, but the room, it was not a room at all. It was a cavernous expanse, stretching infinitely. The walls seemed to pulse, as though alive, rippling and bending as if they could breathe. There were no windows, no exits, just endless darkness. The air was thick with something. An unholy presence, and something else, something almost comforting, like an old memory, long buried. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, unsure if I was speaking to myself or to the thing that had brought me here. And then, the voice answered, "I am everywhere." It was soft, as though it was coming from inside my own skull, but I couldn't ignore it. It was the voice of the woman from the past, the one who had called to me. Her words were chilling, but they also made me feel something, a strange sense of connection, as though we were bound together in this place by forces far older than time itself. I don't understand." I stammered, stepping back, trying to push against the wall. But the wall wasn't solid. It gave way like fabric, absorbing my touch. I jerked my hand away, recoiling. I cannot let you go," the voice continued, this time closer, as if it were standing right behind me. "Not until you see. Not until you understand." I spun around, my pulse thumping in my ears. But again, there was nothing. No form, no figure. Just the suffocating darkness that surrounded me. "Who?" My throat tightened. I could hardly form the words, but I forced them out. "Who are you?" A soft, mocking laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. The sound seemed to fold and stretch in the air, surrounding me on all sides, until it was all I could hear. I was lost. Just as you are. The voice seemed to grow fainter for a moment before returning, this time colder, more bitter. I wandered these halls, much like you, seeking answers that would never come. And now you must finish my journey. The air shifted around me. The shadows writhed, stretching like tendrils, pulling at the edges of my perception. It was as if the very walls were alive, pushing me, guiding me, forcing me into the center of the room where a single beam of light began to materialize, illuminating a small pedestal in the center of the space. There, on the pedestal, was a book. The sight of it hit me with a sudden, visceral punch. It was old, ancient, in fact. The leather cover was cracked, its surface marred with gouges and strange markings I couldn't begin to comprehend. The very air around it seemed to warp, as if the book itself was a source of gravity, pulling at the world in some dark, unnatural way. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Touch it. Take it. Read it, and you will understand. No, I breathed, taking a step back. I had been warned before. I had felt the darkness, the insidious pull of something buried deep beneath this forsaken place. But even as I fought to resist, my body betrayed me. My hands moved of their own accord, reaching toward the book. I didn't want to. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, a searing pain shot through me, racing up my arm, lancing through my chest. I gasped, my body locking up, as the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The world around me twisted, and I saw flashes, visions, horrifying glimpses into a past long buried. I saw the woman, her face, worn and pale, yet familiar. I saw her walking the halls of the inn, looking at me with pleading eyes. I saw her eyes again, wide, unblinking, filled with desperation. And then, her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I felt them. It was him. The vision shifted, and I saw her fall, crumpling to the floor in an empty room, a shadow standing over her, towering above her, casting a monstrous shape that swallowed the light. I couldn't see its face. I didn't need to. The malevolent aura was enough. Please, no. The vision fractured, breaking apart into a cascade of images that tumbled over one another, each one more horrifying than the last. The walls of the inn, smeared with blood, now pulsing like living flesh. The smell of decay thick in the air. Her hand, outstretched, desperately reaching for something, anything. But it was too late. Then, a scream, a sound so pure, so full of agony, it made my very soul ache. I could feel it. Her pain. Her suffering. And something else. Something darker. The thing had taken her. I gasped, ripping my hand away from the book, heart hammering in my chest. The visions blurred, dissipating like smoke in the wind. I staggered backward, the room spinning. You see it now, the voice whispered. You understand. I looked down at my hands, trembling. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming now. The walls around me pulsed, as though the very structure of the inn was alive with its own thoughts. And I could hear it now, the deep rumbling beneath the ground. The thing was here. It had been here all along. I wasn't alone. Have you ever wondered if something that once existed could still linger, hiding in the cracks of time, waiting to be remembered? Or if the echoes of the past can bleed into the present, whispering secrets in the dark corners of our minds? I did not believe in such things. Not until I stepped into the ruins of the Night Palace. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The grand estate, once resplendent with life, was now a crumbling skeleton of its former self. The tall stone walls, streaked with moss and faded by centuries of neglect, loomed before me like the remnants of some forgotten dream. The Night Palace had always intrigued me. I had read about it in dusty old books, heard the hushed whispers of its haunted reputation in old taverns. But never in my wildest dreams had I imagined setting foot inside it. I had come to find answers. The letter that arrived one foggy evening had intrigued me more than any ghost story ever could. It spoke of unfinished business, of promises unkept, and of secrets buried beneath the decaying floors of the palace. I couldn't resist. As I entered the front hall, a cold draft brushed against my skin, raising goosebumps. The scent of must and age clung to the air, but there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible fragrance, like a bouquet of forgotten roses, decaying and fading into the shadows. I paused, listening for any sound, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Only the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, echoing in the oppressive silence. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of people I would never know, faces frozen in time, eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The larger the room became, the more I felt their gaze. Something was wrong. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had begun to creep into my thoughts. It's just a house, I told myself. Nothing more. But then I heard it. A sound so faint I could hardly trust my ears. The flutter of fabric, the whisper of movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining my ears. There it was again. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes darting around the darkened room. Was someone here? I reached for the doorframe, steadying myself, and peered down the long corridor. The once stunning chandeliers were now mere skeletons of metal, draped with cobwebs. The floors, polished within their prime, were now warped and uneven, creaking under my weight with every step. Then I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my own movement, but as I blinked, it became clearer. A woman. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, her figure barely visible in the gloom. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her hair pinned up in a style that seemed from another time entirely. Her face was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light. She did not move. Her gaze, cold and distant, was fixed straight ahead. She was not looking at me, yet I felt her presence like a weight upon my chest, suffocating, pulling the very air from the room. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking in spite of myself. The figure did not respond. She remained perfectly still, as though she had never heard me. My pulse quickened. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my chest tightening with each passing second. Something wasn't right. I took a step toward her, my legs trembling. But as I moved, the hallway seemed to stretch farther before me, the walls warping and twisting, becoming more oppressive with every step. The figure, too, shifted, seeming to glide further away, as though the space between us were expanding. "Wait!" I called out, my voice growing more desperate. "Who are you?" But there was no answer. Only the whisper of fabric in the wind. No, not wind. It came from within the walls. Scratch, scratch. I froze. The sound, like nails on a chalkboard, grated through my mind, making my skin crawl. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something that moved of its own accord. Scratch, scratch. The walls were alive. A low murmur echoed through the hallway, too quiet to decipher, but it wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something ancient, buried beneath the layers of time and decay, clawing its way out. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure, no, not the woman anymore, was moving. She was sliding toward me, her form becoming more defined with every inch she approached, as if the darkness itself was folding around her. But then, the air around her seemed to change. The floorboards beneath me groaned in protest, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against me, like invisible hands reaching through the walls, pulling at my sanity. Scratch, scratch. I turned sharply, the sound now coming from all directions, all at once. I wasn't alone. A cold breath slid down the back of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, my hands trembling as I searched the hallway for an escape. But the figure, no, not a woman, but a thing, was there, its presence growing like a storm, shifting, warping, its form no longer human but something monstrous, something born from darkness itself. No! I could feel its eyes on me, the emptiness of its gaze pressing in. It was pulling at me, threatening to swallow me whole. Then, silence. I stood there, paralyzed, my chest rising and falling with the effort of breathing. The hallway around me was still. There was no sound. But the feeling, the presence, lingered. It was waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that unnerving silence. The faint scratching continued to reverberate in my skull, gnawing at my thoughts, but I couldn't move. My body felt as though it had been encased in ice. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the darkness pressing against me, squeezing the very breath from my lungs. What was happening? For a moment, I thought I imagined the figure, a trick of the light, perhaps. But the feeling of being watched was far too real to ignore. The cold air at the back of my neck, the whispered creak of the floorboards, the sharp, unsettling presence that pressed down upon me like a weight, none of it could be rationalized away. The figure was gone. But the presence, it lingered. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the hallway. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows that danced and twisted across the walls. And there, at the far end of the corridor, the doors to the drawing room stood ajar, slightly swaying in the draft. Had they always been open? I couldn't remember. My mind felt foggy, my senses dulled, as if I had just awoken from a dream. A nightmare. A nightmare I was unwilling to admit I was caught in. The scratching ceased. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move. Every step felt heavy, as though the very floor beneath me was shifting, pulling me deeper into the web of darkness. I tried to focus on something, anything, to steady my racing heart. My eyes locked on the drawing room doors, and despite my fear, despite the deep, unspoken warning to turn around and leave, my feet carried me forward. There was no turning back now. As I reached the threshold of the drawing room, I hesitated. The once opulent chamber now seemed alien, its grandeur distorted by time and decay. The marble floor, which must have once gleamed with the polished perfection of a royal palace, now looked cracked and worn, as though years of neglect had left it scarred and abandoned. The chandeliers above were dark, no flicker of light from the once twinkling crystals. Cobwebs hung from the corners, long tendrils of decay stretching down from the high, vaulted ceiling. And yet, in the middle of the room, a fire burned. a fire that should not have been there. I was certain that when I entered, the room had been empty, untouched by any living soul. But there it was, the hearth glowing faintly with an orange light, the fire crackling softly as if it had just been lit. Impossible. Who's there? My voice wavered, barely above a whisper. No answer. I stepped into the room, my eyes scanning the space. The shadows clung to the walls, moving in strange, unsettling ways. I could hear the rustle of fabric, soft, like the brushing of a gown across the floor. The sounds grew louder, closer. I turned sharply, but nothing was there. Only the fire, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch towards me. Then I saw it. At the far side of the room, beneath a large painting that looked centuries old, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, dark circles framing them as if she had not slept in years. Her hair, wild and unkempt, cascaded around her shoulders like a veil of midnight. She stood motionless in the darkness, her gaze fixed upon me. But this time, she didn't look away. Why are you here? Her voice was like a breeze, soft and chilling, carrying an edge of something ancient and full of sorrow. The words seemed to seep into my bones, their weight unbearable. You shouldn't be here. I froze, the words clinging to me. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat had tightened as though the very air had been sucked from the room. She stepped forward, her bare feet gliding across the dusty floor without a sound. As she drew closer, the light from the fire flickered and dimmed, casting her face in an eerie, shifting glow. Her eyes, empty yet full of haunting pain, locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt a wave of icy fear rush through me. I was promised, she whispered. Her voice cracked like an old branch breaking in the wind. They promised me that they would return. The flames flickered violently, casting eerie, twisted shapes on the walls, as if they, too, were listening to the woman's words. What do you want? I managed to say, my voice hoarse, struggling to maintain some semblance of control. She stopped just a few paces away from me, her presence suffocating, filling the space with a palpable, growing tension. They took everything from me, she continued, her voice trembling, a faint tremor running through her. And I was left here, forgotten. The palace was my prison, my tomb, and they promised they would return and set me free. I didn't know what to say. I didn't understand. Her words didn't make sense. But then, her eyes softened, her expression shifting for just a moment. For an instant, I thought I saw something other than madness, a brief flicker of humanity, of sorrow. But it vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the hollow void behind. You must leave, she said softly, her tone suddenly calm. Before they return. I opened my mouth to ask more, to question her, but the words died on my tongue. A loud crash echoed through the room, startling me. I whirled around, my heart racing. The fire had flared up, an unnatural orange light bathing the room. The paintings on the walls shifted, their faces twisting and distorting. And then, a voice, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very bones of the house, reached my ears. You cannot leave, not now. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone, replaced by a shadow that seemed to merge with the darkness, its form growing more indistinct, more monstrous. The room was closing in on me, the walls twisting and stretching, the air thick with the scent of decay and death. I turned and bolted for the door, my legs unsteady as I stumbled through the collapsing space. The house seemed to pulse with life, the floor shifting beneath my feet, the walls groaning as if they were alive. The shadows danced, stretched, and closed in on me. Then I heard it, faint at first, then louder and clearer with each passing second. The scratching. It was coming from behind me, from every corner, every crevice. The walls themselves seemed to be reaching out, pulling me back into the heart of the darkness. "Leave me be!" I shouted, my voice cracking in panic. But the walls didn't listen. Neither did the shadows. They pressed in on me, suffocating, until all I could do was run. I ran. But no matter how fast I moved, the house kept shifting, the rooms rearranging, the corridors endless. The firelight was gone, replaced by the oppressive darkness. The figure, the voice, followed me, lingering just behind. And then, from the deepest corner of my mind, the question I had been too afraid to ask emerged, more pressing than ever. What is it that waits for me in the night palace? I was running blindly now, my breath ragged and sharp in my chest. The house, once regal and magnificent, had turned into a labyrinth of nightmares. The walls groaned as if alive, the floorboards beneath me creaked, twisting and bending in unnatural directions. I could feel my heart in my throat, a thunderous, frantic beat that drowned out the cacophony of whispers swirling around me. The shadows chased me, morphing into grotesque figures that flickered at the edge of my vision. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out, but before I could touch her, the room shifted. The floor beneath me cracked, the ceiling above seemed to cave inwards. The bookshelves wavered, their contents spilling out in a storm of paper and dust. Then I heard it. The low growl. A sound so deep, so guttural, that it seemed to come from the very earth beneath me. It rumbled through the room, vibrating through my bones. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted again, taking form. Shapes. Figures. I turned, heart pounding, but the hallway was no longer there. The door to the library had vanished, and in its place was only darkness. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the house itself were trying to swallow me whole. I ran. I ran through the collapsing room, stumbling, my hands reaching for anything solid. The walls closed in, the floor buckling beneath my weight. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I heard a voice, not from the woman, but from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. "Do not trust the ghosts, stranger. They are not what they seem." I froze. The voice was not human. It came from the very walls, from the house itself. And then the floor gave way. I fell. The last thing I saw was the figure of a woman, standing in the doorway, her face now twisted in a silent scream. I hit the ground hard. The fall wasn't long, but the impact left me breathless, the air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, gasping, trying to steady my thoughts. I could feel the cold stone floor beneath me, rough and uneven, like the floor of an ancient tomb. My head spun, and I pushed myself up, hands trembling, but something in the air around me felt wrong, like I was no longer in the house I had been exploring, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere darker. I wiped the dust from my hands and slowly, painfully, stood. My legs were unsteady, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A subtle but undeniable weight, pressing down on me from all directions. As I looked around, I realized I was no longer in the grand library. The walls had shifted. I had fallen through some hidden passage into a forgotten part of the house, a labyrinth of crumbling stone, narrow hallways, and doorways that seemed to stretch and recede before my eyes. There was a heaviness in the air, as if this place had been undisturbed for centuries. No one had walked here in so long that the very walls had started to weep. A low, mournful sound echoed through the narrow corridor. It was like a wind, but it wasn't wind. It was more like a sigh. I pressed my back to the cold stone wall, my breath shallow, and strained to listen. It came again. The sigh. But this time it was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Help me." I froze. My pulse quickened, blood rushing in my ears. The voice was faint, distant, like a memory trying to claw its way to the surface. I had to move. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I couldn't tell if the sound was real or if I was losing my mind. But there was something about it. Something about the desperation in that whisper. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling but sharp, forcing the words past my lips despite the terror building in my chest. The whisper stopped. Then, for a moment, there was nothing but silence, deep, suffocating silence. I turned, instinctively reaching for the nearest doorframe. The wooden door ahead of me was slightly ajar, the faintest hint of light seeping through the crack. The temperature in the air dropped several degrees, and a shiver ran through me. I should have been cautious. I should have turned back. But curiosity gnawed at me, urging me forward, and something darker, something more primal, pushed me toward the door. I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound as I approached the threshold. I hesitated before pushing the door open. The room beyond was vast, yet claustrophobic in its own way. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the stone floor was slick with moisture. What caught my eye immediately was the chandelier hanging above, not with the usual crystals, but with something other, something that seemed to shimmer and move in the dim light, like spectral hands brushing across the glass. I didn't dare take a step forward. Something about this room felt wrong. Then I saw her. The figure of a woman standing in the center of the room. She was draped in a white gown, but the fabric seemed to writhe, as if it were made of smoke or shadows, constantly shifting. Her hair, dark and tangled, hung in front of her face, but there was something strangely still about her posture. She didn't move, yet I felt her presence grow stronger, like a pressure building in my chest. Is she real? The thought crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. What difference did it make at this point? I stepped into the room, my feet sliding silently on the stone floor. I could hear my breath, slow and ragged, mixing with the distant echoes of what seemed like crying. No, it was laughter. Soft, but cruel. The sound swirled around me, filling the space with a sense of dread. I couldn't look away from the woman. She stood as still as a statue, and yet something about her made every instinct in me scream run. "Are you the one who called out?" I asked, my voice shaky but loud enough to reach her. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, her head tilted slightly, and she raised it. Slowly, cautiously. I could see her face now, but it was covered in a layer of translucent, fluid-like tendrils, like the strands of seaweed caught in the currents of some deep, forgotten ocean. Her eyes, if they could even be called that, were nothing but hollow pits, staring right through me. "Help me," she whispered again, but this time it was more than a plea. It was an order, a demand. I froze. My entire body seemed to lock in place. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Her voice, it wasn't just in my ears now. It was inside my head, rattling my thoughts, pulling them apart piece by piece. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Her voice was too powerful, like a magnetic force drawing me in. The chandelier overhead flickered again, and with the flickering, the shadows around her began to move. Twisting, stretching. They reached out, thin tendrils of darkness lashing at the air, brushing against my skin. The walls seemed to grow closer, the room itself bending inward. The laughter, soft at first, became louder, a high-pitched cackle that grated against my nerves. Her voice grew stronger. Do you know what they did to me? Do you know what they took from me? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, the walls seemed to answer for me. It's too late. The voice came from behind me, from deep within the stone itself. It was low, guttural, and ancient, full of pain and anger. I turned to see where the voice had come from, but there was no one there. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe. It's too late to save her, to save anyone. The voice was closer now, its words shaking the very foundation of the room. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, my mind in a frenzy. I turned my head back to the woman, but she was no longer standing still. She had moved. No, she was moving, but not with human speed. Her body slid across the room like liquid, twisting and contorting in ways that defied reason. And the eyes, those hollow pits, focused directly on me. You cannot leave. The ground beneath me trembled. Then, the world went black. I woke with a start. My chest heaved as if I had been holding my breath for hours, and my skin was clammy, slick with sweat. My surroundings were unfamiliar, soft, lush carpet beneath me, the air warm and stale. My heart raced as I struggled to make sense of where I was. I sat up quickly, glancing around. The chandelier, the woman, the flickering shadows, they were gone. The room was dark, but not oppressive. It felt ordinary, yet my mind screamed that nothing was ordinary about it. I was back in the grand hall, the one I had entered when I first came to the mansion. The walls, once lined with cracks, now seemed perfectly intact. No faded portraits, no chipped woodwork. The fireplace opposite me was cold and unused, but the hearth was no longer filled with ash. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to steady myself, but my hands were shaking. Was it a dream? My breath came in shallow bursts. There was a knot in my stomach that refused to loosen. No, it wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. That woman, her face, her voice, her demand. I rose to my feet, unsteady, my gaze flickering to the entrance. The door I had entered through was wide open, its hinges creaking slightly. But there was something strange about the open door. It led nowhere. Outside, the endless expanse of the mansion's garden should have stretched out, but instead, I could see nothing but a dense, impenetrable fog. The garden had vanished. In its place was a void, a yawning abyss that stretched endlessly into nothingness. My mind tried to make sense of it. This place wasn't real. Or at least, it wasn't what I thought it was. The walls of the mansion, these perfect walls, had betrayed me. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. I stiffened, my hand reaching instinctively for the nearest chair to steady myself. A figure emerged from the corner of the room. At first, it was just a shadow, soft, almost fluid. But as it drew closer, it took on shape, and I saw that it was a man. A tall figure, hunched slightly, his movements slow but deliberate. The air grew colder. He wore an old military uniform, faded and torn. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, as if he had been starving for a long time. Yet, despite his physical appearance, he didn't seem frail. There was something unnatural about him, something wrong. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper, but it felt loud in the eerie silence of the room. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he looked around, his expression distant, as if he was searching for something or someone. Then, his eyes locked on me, his hollow gaze sending a shiver down my spine. "I was once like you." His voice was rough, a rasp that seemed to emerge from deep within him, a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "Like me?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" He took a step forward, his boots making no sound against the soft carpet. The room seemed to close in, the walls tightening with each passing second. "Trapped," he whispered, his words barely audible, as if he was speaking more to himself than to me. "Trapped in the night, like all of us here." I didn't understand. "Trapped? What do you want from me?" A faint, twisted smile appeared on his face, but it was unsettling, devoid of warmth. "What?" His voice turned sharp, as if something in my question had struck a chord. "I do not want anything anymore. But you, child, you have come. You are the one we have been waiting for." My heart stopped. I wanted to run, to scream, to flee from the madness that was unfolding before me, but I couldn't. Something held me there. His eyes, the same hollow stare from the woman, pulled me deeper into the darkness. The man raised a bony hand, and the room around us seemed to warp again. The fog outside the door crept in, curling around the edges of the room like a living thing. The walls began to twist, the floor to groan as though the very house was coming alive. "You will see soon enough," he murmured, his voice growing distant, as if the room was pulling him away. "The palace has woken. The past, it never stays buried." My breath caught in my throat. "The past?" I repeated, my voice trembling. The man's face twisted in a grimace, but his eyes, those soulless eyes, remained fixed on mine. "The past never leaves. It lingers, haunts. Even in the brightest day, it is never gone." I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but the fog had reached the threshold. The figure of the man began to dissolve into the mist, his body thinning as if it were made of smoke. I could hear him speaking, but his words were muffled now, swallowed by the fog that was quickly filling the room. "You will understand in time," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "In time." I backed away, my legs shaking. "I have to get out of here." I ran. The door that once led to an empty garden now seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The mist, thick and suffocating, clung to my skin as I pushed forward, but I couldn't breathe. The air was too dense. My lungs burned. As I reached the door, I shoved it open, expecting to find the same void outside, the same endless blackness. But instead, I found only light, bright, blinding light. I staggered forward, shielding my eyes, but then the light blinked out. The world around me dissolved. The walls, the floor, the door, they all vanished in an instant. I was falling again, falling through nothingness. I reached out, my hands grabbing at empty air. The sensation of falling didn't stop, but there was no ground to land on, no walls to stop me. I screamed, and then there was silence. Have you ever heard the sounds of a place that shouldn't be alive, but somehow still is? A place that should be abandoned, forgotten, It hums with the rhythm of life when the rest of the world sleeps. I have. And now, I can never forget it. I first came across the old factory when I needed work. It was the only place still hiring in the dying part of the city, the one everyone else had abandoned years ago. The building itself was a hulking shadow on the edge of the industrial district, its windows long cracked, its iron gates rusted and locked. Most people wouldn't even glance at it, but I was desperate. The manager, a man named Mr. Cross, didn't seem to care that the place looked as though it had been untouched for decades. Work starts at midnight. You'll be in the back, by the old machines, he said with a voice so low it sent a slight shiver down my spine. I accepted, figuring it was just another dead-end job. The pay was decent, and frankly, I had no choice. But that night, as I stepped into the factory, I began to realize how wrong I was. The building was suffocating, its air thick with dust, machinery covered in a layer of neglect. But even in the stagnant silence, I could hear it. A faint hum, like the sound of a motor winding up, or a distant conversation. It seemed to come from somewhere deep within the factory. I shook my head, blaming my exhaustion. Surely, I was just imagining it. As I made my way to the back, past rows of machines frozen in time, a strange smell filled the air, faintly metallic, mixed with something sour, like old oil gone rancid. I breathed it in, but it only made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The factory was too quiet, too still for comfort. The room where I was assigned was dimly lit, with only a single overhead light casting shadows on the floor. There, I found the old machines, some of them still, others faintly twitching with life. I stood there for a moment, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears, then I heard it. A faint clink, like metal striking metal. I turned sharply, eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Just the silent machinery, gathering dust in the gloom. I'm just tired, I told myself. It's nothing. But deep down, I knew the place wasn't empty. That's when the whispers began. They were soft at first, voices that seemed to drift in and out of hearing range. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But the longer I stood there, the clearer they became. They're still here. One whispered, "Justice." Another hissed. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the shadows, from the machines, from the very walls themselves. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath as a thin mist in the air. The factory. It wasn't just a building. It was alive, haunted by something I couldn't yet understand. I stumbled towards the exit, my mind racing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, as if someone, or something, was watching me. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered, clearer this time. I spun around, eyes wide. But no one was there. The room was empty. I heard footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing in the stillness. The sound was uneven, dragging. I moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, my pulse quickening. As I rounded a corner, I froze. There, standing by an old press machine, was a figure. Tall, emaciated, its face covered in shadows. The figure's eyes gleamed in the dim light, empty sockets staring into my soul. It reached toward me, its hand elongated, fingers twisted in unnatural ways. My heart raced. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. "Get out, now," the figure rasped. I couldn't breathe. My legs finally moved, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over the edge of a rusted machine. I ran. The factory seemed to stretch before me, endless and oppressive. The walls closed in, the air growing colder. Every step I took felt like a lifetime, the whispers intensifying, becoming a deafening roar. My mind scrambled for escape, but I couldn't find it. It's too late, I thought. The figure followed, its footsteps now loud and distinct, as if it were just behind me, waiting to strike. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, closing in. Suddenly, the door that had once led to the outside, the door I had entered through, was gone. In its place was a wall of rusted metal, sealed tight. I pounded on the door, desperate. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling from the terror that was clawing at my mind. I turned to face the figure. It was closer now, its twisted hand reaching out for me, its mouth opening in a silent scream. "You'll never leave," it whispered. The walls were closing in on me. I could hear the machines rumbling to life, the clanging and screeching of metal grinding against metal. But it wasn't just the machines. It was the sound of souls, trapped, restless, forever demanding justice for the lives they had lost. The ground beneath me began to shake. I fell to my knees, unable to stand, as the factory seemed to collapse around me. And then, darkness. I woke with a start, gasping for breath as if I had been underwater for hours. The cold metal of the factory floor was hard beneath me, my body stiff and aching from the fall. My head throbbed, and my chest burned as though I had been running for miles. I tried to push myself up, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Everything was wrong. The factory was no longer the same. I blinked, disoriented, my senses struggling to catch up. The walls were now covered in grime, as though time had suddenly accelerated, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The low hum of the machines that had haunted me before was now louder, more insistent, like the heartbeat of a living creature. Every machine, from the presses to the old looms, seemed to be twitching, shaking, coming alive in an unsettling symphony of mechanical life. "Where am I?" I whispered hoarsely. But I already knew the answer. It wasn't the factory I had seen before. This was something else. I slowly rose to my feet, my movements sluggish, my mind racing with images of the figure, of the twisted hand that had reached for me. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse like thunder in my ears. I staggered forward, trying to find the exit, but the walls seemed to shift as I moved. I passed the same broken machines, the same rusted pipes, and then something caught my eye. A figure, like a shadow, hovered by one of the old workbenches. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was hunched over, its back bent in an unnatural arch, its limbs too long, too thin. It turned toward me, its face hidden beneath a tattered cap. Its hands, skeletal and trembling, reached out to the air as if it were grasping at something just beyond reach. "You," the figure rasped. Its voice was like nails scraping across glass, a sound so sharp that it hurt my ears. "You should not have come." I took a step back, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Why? Why am I here? I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure raised its head slowly, and for a moment, I thought I saw nothing but darkness where its face should have been. But then, like a veil lifting, I saw the eyes, empty, hollow pits where once there had been life. The air seemed to chill even further, and the shadows around me grew longer, stretching like fingers reaching out to grab me. The figure took a step toward me. They made us work until we could not anymore. The machines, they took us. You hear them, don't you? The machines never stop. The work, it never stops. I could feel the weight of its words, heavy like a chain dragging me down. My legs trembled, my knees weak from the terror of the unknown. The whispers from the machines grew louder, more chaotic, as if the factory itself was coming alive, demanding something from me. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. We were once like you. The forgotten. The ones left behind. And now, we are the ones who wait. Wait for justice, for vengeance. I swallowed hard, the taste of metal in my mouth. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though the very earth was shifting. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hands reaching for me, fingers clawing at the air. Suddenly, a shrill noise pierced the air, the sound of metal grinding against metal, a screeching cry from one of the machines. It echoed through the factory, rattling the walls, shaking the very floor beneath me. The figure recoiled, its hands clutching its head. The machines, they hunger. They want more. More souls. More life. I turned, searching for the source of the noise, my mind in overdrive. My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear almost choking me. What had happened to this place? What had I stepped into? The machines, they weren't just machines anymore. They were alive. Alive with the souls of the dead, the spirits of those who had been lost here, those who had never been allowed to rest. I turned back to the figure, but it was gone. Vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing but the cold air in its wake. I need to leave. I thought, the urge to escape pushing me forward, away from the horrors that seemed to pulse through the factory. But as I ran, the factory stretched before me, its walls closing in. Every turn I took led to more twisted corridors, more darkened rooms. The machines groaned, the sound growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't tell which direction I was going anymore. The factory had become a maze, a labyrinth that twisted and shifted, mocking my every attempt to escape. And then, I saw it. In the distance, through the thick shadows, a faint light flickered. It beckoned me, promising an end to the nightmare. I ran toward it, my footsteps echoing against the cold concrete floor. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a light at all. It was a figure. Another one. A woman, standing motionless in the center of a room filled with abandoned machines. She wore a faded dress, her face obscured by a veil of tangled hair. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. This woman, there was something wrong about her. She seemed wrong. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, yet somehow seeing everything. She turned her head slowly toward me, and I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the machines. "We need to be heard." Before I could react, the room plunged into darkness, and the machinery came to life with a deafening roar. I was trapped again. The darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, suffocating and absolute. The sounds of the machines, once a distant hum, now filled the air with a deafening clatter, like bones rattling in a great, unseen beast's maw. The very walls of the factory seemed to pulse with life, their cold, metal skin vibrating with the rhythm of a monstrous heartbeat. I could barely breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, the rhythm of it competing with the relentless clamor of the factory. I reached out, blindly groping for something, anything, solid. My hand scraped across cold, oily machinery, the rusted surface sending shivers up my spine. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, like the soft murmur of a distant dream, but unmistakable. Help us. It was a whisper, but it carried through the darkness like a sharp blade. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt heavier now, thick with the stench of oil and decay. The shadows pressed in closer, stretching unnaturally against the walls. The floor beneath my feet groaned as if the building itself were alive with the hunger of a forgotten past. Help us, before it's too late. I spun around, my pulse quickening. There was no one. Only shadows and machines. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Who's there? My voice cracked, sounding small and fragile in the vast emptiness of the factory. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but the factory remained eerily still, save for the low hum of the machines. Then, just as the silence threatened to smother me, I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the factory floor. The dim light from a flickering overhead bulb barely illuminated the shape, tall, thin, almost skeletal. It was a man, though his features were obscured by a hood, his face hidden in shadow. The air seemed to grow colder as I watched him, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle on my gut. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his presence was suffocating. I took a cautious step forward, and then another. My legs felt heavy, reluctant to move. The floor beneath me seemed to shift, groaning like a living thing, as if it too didn't want me to approach. Who are you? I asked again, this time louder, more desperate. What is this place? The figure did not respond, but his head tilted slightly, as if considering my words. The sound of the machines, the grinding, the screeching, it all seemed to stop for a moment. A deep, oppressive silence fell over the factory. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the man spoke. You shouldn't have come. The words struck me like a blow to the chest. My heart thudded painfully, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Why shouldn't I have come? I managed to ask, my voice trembling despite myself. The figure lifted his hand slowly, his fingers long and thin, the joints creaking as if they hadn't moved in years. He pointed toward the far corner of the factory, where the shadows were deepest. There are things here that you cannot understand. Things that hunger for your soul. My mind raced. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The machines, they are not just machines, he continued, his voice growing softer, more distant. They are the keepers. The ones who bind us. The ones who make us stay. I stepped forward again, the ground beneath me trembling with every movement. Who are you? What happened here? I demanded. The air felt thick, as if every word I spoke was swallowed by the factory, leaving nothing but an echo. The figure's lips twisted into a sad, almost pitying smile. We were the ones who built it. I blinked, confusion clouding my thoughts. Built what? The figure's eyes, pale, lifeless, glittered with something that could only be described as sorrow. The factory. Before I could react, a horrible, mechanical screech filled the air, drowning out his words. I looked around, panic rising in my chest as the machines began to churn again, each one louder than the last, each one shaking the very foundation of the factory. The sound was unbearable, like the scream of a dying animal, its pain echoing in every corner. And then, through the noise, I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, weak and strained, but unmistakable. "Help us." It whispered again, so faint I could hardly make it out. I turned frantically toward the source, but all I saw was the endless expanse of machines, their gears turning without reason, their steel jaws grinding against each other with an eerie precision. The factory had become a labyrinth of noise and shadow, a place that existed somewhere between the living and the dead. "Who is that?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Who is calling out?" The figure stepped back, vanishing into the shadows with an almost unnatural grace. "You cannot leave until it is done, until they are heard." Before I could respond, the factory's lights flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. And then, all at once, I felt it. The floor beneath me was no longer solid. The ground, alive with the rhythm of machinery, shifted and buckled, as if the very factory itself were trying to swallow me whole. I gasped, stumbling, my heart in my throat. The darkness was suffocating, but I felt the cold, skeletal hand of someone, brush against my skin. A whisper, too soft to hear, danced across my ear. "You will never leave until we are free." My chest tightened. The panic surged once more, but there was no escaping it. The factory, the curse of the old factory, had me now. It wasn't just a place of machines and steel. It was a tomb, a prison, and I was its next victim. I could hear my breath, shallow and frantic, in the oppressive silence. The darkness around me seemed to press against my skin, its cold fingers tightening around my throat. I had no idea where I was anymore, or how much time had passed. I could barely think, only feel the raw terror gnawing at my insides, clawing at my sanity. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. What is happening here? Who are they? What do they want? And yet, in the suffocating blackness, there was a single truth. I wasn't alone. There were others in the factory. And they were watching. The voices had faded. The whispers that had taunted and pleaded, had they gone? Had they been real at all? I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched to find something, anything, solid to hold on to. The floor beneath me was slick with oil and something else, something thick, that I couldn't identify. The ground shifted beneath my feet, as though the factory itself was alive, responding to my every step. It knows I'm here. It's waiting. I took a hesitant step forward, trying to ignore the dizzying feeling of being drawn into the darkness, toward the echo of that first whisper. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough to drown out the noises of the factory. But then, a sudden, sharp clank sounded from somewhere behind me, followed by the unmistakable hum of machinery stirring to life. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one. Only the shadows, deeper now, darker, shifting like the writhing of an unseen mass. The sounds of the factory, faint at first, grew louder. The hum grew into a growl, the thudding of gears and pistons filling the air like the roaring of a distant beast. I took another step back, my legs unsteady beneath me. I could hear the machines now, their once moribund limbs groaning with a terrifying vitality. And yet, there was something wrong with their rhythm. Something off. It was as though they were not merely functioning again, but were aware. "They are awake," the voice echoed again, now louder, closer. My body tensed, the air thickening with dread. I turned my head to the source of the voice, but again, I saw nothing. "Help us." The voice cracked, almost like a sigh, full of desperation. It was coming from every direction now, swirling around me, drowning me. Who? Who is there? I gasped, my voice trembling, but the words only made the whispers intensify. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The machines roared to life once more, their heavy gears grinding with a newfound frenzy. The factory had become a living, breathing thing, its pulse a violent, unholy rhythm. The stench of rust and oil filled my nostrils, the metallic tang sharp and acrid in the stagnant air. Suddenly, I heard a voice close to my ear, so close I could feel its breath. He will come for you. The words were low, urgent, but muffled, like a lover's whisper at the edge of a nightmare. I spun around, my eyes wide, but the darkness was endless, swirling like an abyss. The shadows seemed to stretch, distort, and the factory groaned with the weight of unseen presence, a heaviness that pressed down on me, suffocating. And then, a soft, cruel laugh. It was a woman's laugh. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The laughter echoed through the factory, bouncing off the walls and filling my ears. There was no humor in it. No joy. Only bitterness and anguish. You shouldn't have come. The voice, sharp and cold, seeped into my bones. We were once like you, so full of life, so eager, but now we are nothing. Just like the machines, we are trapped. You will be, too. I gasped for breath. Who, what, are you? I shouted, the words leaving my mouth before I could think better of it. The factory seemed to pause, as though considering my words. The machines, their relentless noise momentarily silenced, seemed to wait. And then, out of the silence, the voice spoke again, clearer, more direct. We are the lost ones, it said, its tone hollow, like an echo from the depths of the earth. The forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine, the words sending tremors through me. The lost ones. I whispered to myself, not understanding. We built this place, the voice continued, now laced with venom. We gave it life. But it betrayed us. Took us, twisted us into something else. My breath hitched to my throat. No, that's impossible, I muttered, stepping backward. This can't be real. But I could feel it. It was real. The factory was alive, and it was hungry. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the machines, once just old, abandoned relics, were becoming more than they had ever been. They were becoming sentient. The floor rumbled beneath my feet. I felt a shift in the air, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the factory were exhaling its breath. We are trapped, the voice whispered again, the sound of it now rising to a shriek, and so will you be. I spun around, my mind racing, searching for an escape. But the factory stretched out endlessly, its dark hallways and twisted corridors mocking me, offering no way out. The walls seemed to grow taller, closer, the machinery that once felt distant now crowding around me, enclosing me. And then, like a clap of thunder, the machines roared to life. They were coming for me. I had no choice but to run. I ran. My legs, heavy with terror, barely carried me as the factory groaned and twisted around me. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, but there was something else, a sour, almost sweet stench that clung to the walls, a scent that made my stomach churn. My breath came in jagged gasps, echoing in the eerie silence, broken only by the thunderous roar of the machines that seemed to be chasing me, their relentless grinding just behind me. I stumbled, the cold metal floor beneath my feet slick with oil, my shoes sliding with every step. The sounds of the factory seemed to press in on me, closing the distance between us. The machines, old, rusted and lifeless just moments before, were alive now, their gears turning, their pistons pumping, and I could hear them, almost feel them, reaching for me. "We warned you," the voice whispered again, this time not from behind, but from all around. It was no longer a single voice, but a chorus, 1,000 whispers rising up from the bowels of the factory. "You cannot escape." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. I had to find an exit. There had to be one. There had to be something. The shadows twisted before me, the darkness seeming to shift in a way that was unnatural. Every corner I turned, every hallway I ran down, the factory's grip seemed to tighten. The lights flickered, casting long, stretching shadows that danced along the walls like mocking figures, laughing at my futile attempts to escape. "You think you can run from us?" I didn't dare to look back, but I heard the sound of someone moving through the factory with me, just behind me. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, the presence of something malevolent just inches away. I turned a corner, my breath coming faster, but there was nowhere to hide. The factory was a labyrinth, and I was trapped within it. The voice became more insistent, more urgent. "You cannot outrun what you have awakened," it said, its tone venomous. "You have disturbed the peace of the dead, and now you will pay." A loud bang echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of machinery clanking to life. It was no longer distant, it was close. The factory was alive, every inch of it, its pulse thumping in time with mine. The walls felt as though they were closing in, narrowing, as though the factory itself was drawing in its breath, preparing for something terrible. I darted down another hallway, my mind a blur, the passageway stretching endlessly before me, and yet all I could think about was the cold presence behind me. The footsteps, those weren't my own. They were too heavy, too mechanical, the sound of gears grinding against each other, a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. "Come to us," the voice whispered again, only now it was no longer a whisper, it was a command, an order. "We are waiting for you." I rounded another corner, heart hammering in my chest, and for a moment I thought I saw her, just at the end of the corridor. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, moving with the grace of something otherworldly. Her outline flickered, like a mirage, before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I froze, breath caught in my throat. "Do you see us now?" The voice was louder. "Now!" It was no longer a chorus, it was one, a single voice, growing clearer, closer. "We are the ones who built this place. The ones you forsake. You will never leave." A horrible realization twisted my stomach. The figure, the one I had seen, the woman, she was one of them. A ghost, a spirit, a soul trapped in the machinery, trapped in the factory. She was one of the lost workers, one of the souls who had perished in these very halls. "We built this factory," her voice rang in my ears, icy and sharp, but it betrayed us. "We bled here. We died here. And now you have come. You will join us." I backed up, my pulse racing as the factory seemed to shudder, the walls groaning with life. The machinery, what had once been abandoned, was alive with a malevolent force, thrumming with energy like a beast that had woken from a long slumber. I couldn't stay here. I had to escape. But the paths kept changing. The factory was alive and twisting, like an organism that could bend to its will. I ran again, faster this time, but the machines kept pace. I could hear their breathless hum behind me. It was growing louder. Closer. Leave me alone. I screamed, my voice raw and desperate. But the factory didn't care. It never had. I turned another corner and saw, at the end of the hallway, the massive factory doors. They were so close, so tantalizingly close. The way out. The escape. But as I sprinted toward them, I saw the shadow shift in the doorway, blocking my exit. It was her again, the woman from the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, unblinking. There was something in those eyes, a hunger, a rage. She reached out, a cold, skeletal hand extended toward me, and the factory groaned as if answering her call. "You cannot escape," she said, her voice a rasping whisper, like metal scraping against metal. "You belong to us now." I skidded to a stop, terror locking me in place. The factory seemed to roar, the walls vibrating with an inhuman fury, and I knew there was no escape. The machines, the ghosts, they were closing in. The darkness was swallowing me whole. In that moment, I realized the truth. I had awakened something I could never undo. The factory wasn't haunted. It was haunted. It was alive, and it had claimed its next victim. The doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping me inside. And as I looked into the woman's eyes, I understood. I would never leave. None of us would. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.